This presentation is an overview of the relations among Texas, Mexico, and the United States during a 27-year period from 1821 to 1848. The period begins with the independence of Mexico from Spain, which they won in 1821. About the same time, Mexico invited American settlers to move into Texas. Why? Well, first of all, it was very sparsely populated. They wanted to increase its population, to increase economic activity, to bring in more tax revenue. So they invited Americans to come into Texas, and a good number of them accepted the offer. But over the next 15 years or so, tensions grew between these English-speaking Texans and the Mexican government. In 1836, these Texans won their independence and created a separate nation, which was called officially the Republic of Texas, known commonly as the Lone Star Republic. It was always their intention to eventually join the United States as a state. They were Americans, and this was clearly something that they wanted from the beginning. In 1845, they got their wish. Texas was annexed by the United States, added on to the territory of the United States as a state. That worsened already poor relations between the United States and Mexico, and contributed in a major way to the Mexican-American War, which was fought from 1846 to 48. Now that was an overview. Let's go into these events in more detail. The leader of these early American settlers of English-speaking American settlers of Texas was Stephen Austin. He was asked to do this by his father on his father's deathbed. His father had worked out a deal with the Mexican government. He knew then that he would be unable to carry it out, so he asked his son to do it, and Stephen did. The Mexicans began to place more and more conditions on the Americans living in Texas. They said they wanted them to become Mexican citizens, to convert to Catholicism, which was a major thorn for many of them, because they were overwhelmingly Protestant. And this was an even bigger issue, they could not import more slaves. The whole reason they came to Texas was to grow cotton, and to do that with slave labor. And when they were told they couldn't bring more slaves in, that was, in their view, an outrage. There is a close relationship between the price of land and the importance of slavery. Land was cheap in Texas. That was what attracted these settlers. But because land was cheap, any not enslaved workers would simply want to buy their own land and would generally be able to do that. So they really couldn't attract the workers that they needed to make that land profitable. You can have all the land in the world, but if you don't have the labor to farm it, then it isn't worth anything to you. So they had to have a workforce that was not free, that could not own its own land. And of course, they expanded slavery in order to achieve that. The Mexican government also put a tariff on goods imported from the United States, raising the price of goods that they were interested in bringing in. And so all of these events contributed to terrible relations between these English-speaking settlers of Texas and the Mexican government. Their war for independence was dominated by three battles that were only a few weeks apart early in 1836. The massacre at the Alamo was the siege by a much larger force of Mexicans under Santa Anna, who was both a general and the dictator of the country, against a small group of Americans confined to the Alamo. They held out for 13 days and ultimately were defeated and mostly massacred. There was another massacre shortly after that at Goliad, in which 300 Americans were simply lined up and shot by firing squads. These became rallying cries for the Texans. Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad. The key battle that decided the war really was the Battle of San Jacinto. This was a victory for Texans. They captured Santa Anna, and they held him captive until they got what they wanted. Their leader was Sam Houston, and as a result of that, the independence of Texas was achieved. But they forced Santa Anna to sign a document, a treaty, while he was in captivity, which certainly today any court of law would disallow, because when you're forced to sign something under duress, in other words, under pressure, then that signature is null and void. But the Texans took that as a legal justification for controlling Texas and for defining boundaries of Texas that were much larger than their occupation, than their settlements would justify. This was the flag that they adopted, still the flag of Texas, and obviously modeled after the American flag, with the clear intention of joining the United States. Now, we need to look carefully at this map, because this will help to define the issues here. The traditional boundaries of Texas were in this yellow area here, and the southern boundary was the Nueces River. This green area here was in dispute. The Texans, based on that treaty that they forced Santa Anna to sign, claimed that their territory extended all the way to the Rio Grande River here. So there was this dispute while Texas was an independent nation. And then when Texas was admitted to the United States accepted the larger definition of Texas, which included all this green area. But that was never accepted by the Mexican government. And in fact, those people who did live in this green area here were Mexicans who spoke Spanish. And historically, this had been part of Mexico, not part of the Mexican province of Texas. Now, when Congress came to consider the possibility of admitting Texas as a state, there were arguments on both sides. They were certainly, many members of Congress were hungry for territory, for the expansion of slavery, but also for the idea of manifest destiny. That idea of manifest destiny is important. Manifest means shown, obvious, something you can see, and destiny is something that's bound to be. So the idea of manifest destiny was that it was simply inevitable. It was bound to happen that the United States would expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This was a term that was coined by an Irish immigrant editor by the name of John O'Sullivan in 1845. Another factor that lent urgency to the annexation of Texas was the fact that Britain was interested in it. It would have been a buffer against further American expansion, which Britain was concerned about. It could have helped to supply Britain's colonies in the Caribbean. So some members of Congress felt that it was necessary to act quickly on this before the British could get their hands on Texas. It was valuable land. East Texas was valuable land for growing cotton, which of course appealed to Southerners. And they were anxious to strengthen and expand the institution of slavery. And that, of course, would happen in Texas as well. Arguments on the other side were that it might provoke war with Mexico, and of course it did that, that it would increase the political power of the slave states. There was the fear that as the expansion moved westward, especially in the southern part of the country, it would increase the number of slave states. And as it was, when Texas was admitted to the Union, there was an advantage of one more slave state than there were free states. This was a temporary advantage that nevertheless was a concern to many Northerners. And those who were opposed to slavery looked at that same fact, the expansion of slavery, and saw that as a negative, as a threat. The Mexican War, which resulted from this, was fought in quite a number of different places, extending up into California and going as far south as Mexico City, the capital. The war began in this area right here. General Zachary Taylor was ordered by President James Polk to march right down to the Rio Grande River. Polk had attempted to buy a large area of northern Mexico for $30 million, and Mexico said no. So his next option, he believed, was to go to war. He knew that this would provoke Mexico. He wanted war. Polk clearly wanted war. Now, how you consider this territory, how you look at it, makes all the difference in the world in how you understand the events that came next. From the American point of view, this was American soil. And when Mexican forces attacked Americans in this disputed area, they were attacking American troops on American soil. They had invaded the United States, and this was simply unacceptable, and that was the justification for war. That's the way Polk and most members of Congress looked at it. But there's an entirely different interpretation that the Mexicans had, and that is that this was Mexican territory, and that the invasion had been carried out by the United States, and these Mexican forces were simply defending their own territory. Now, clearly they fired the first shot, but it makes an enormous difference whether or not they had been invaded. The historical occupancy of this area would support the Mexican interpretation. Most of the people living there were Spanish-speaking Mexicans. And yet, this was not the way it was viewed in Washington. At any rate, war was declared. There was an outbreak in California of Americans living there. They rebelled against the Mexican government outpost there and established a brief government of their own before American troops arrived to take over. This brief revolt was known as the Bear Flag Revolt, and even today the flag of California contains a picture of a bear. We're not going to go through the battles in detail, but the key battles of the war were at Monterrey and Mexico City. I'm sorry, at Veracruz and Mexico City. And finally, when Mexico City was captured, it was clear that the war was nearing a conclusion. Now, so the war began with border incidents. It included the Bear Flag Revolt in California. It progressed to an American invasion of Mexico proper, and it ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. And And to return to the previous slide, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the United States this interpretation of Texas, which included land all the way to the Rio Grande, and it gave the United States land that includes present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, an enormous area, the entire southwestern United States. And if you count Texas, this was half the territory of Mexico. Even without Texas, is about 40% of the territory of Mexico. So this was an enormous territorial shift as a result of this war. The U.S. paid Mexico $15 million for it. That's half of the offer that the Mexicans had earlier rejected. But one newspaper commented that we take nothing by conquest, thank God, meaning that we have paid for it, overlooking the fact that this was coerced. It was a forced transaction. A major part of the consequences of the Mexican War would show up in the Civil War. 14, 15 years after the beginning of the Mexican War, the United States had to deal with the consequences of all that territory in the Civil War. In 1846, around the beginning of the war, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, proposed that no territory that was gained from Mexico, since we knew that it would be very likely that we would gain territory from Mexico, he proposed that no territory would be open to slavery. Now, the Northerners were afraid that with all that territory that we were likely to gain, that there would be a large number of slave states added to the Union, and that would give the balance of political power to the South. This created a firestorm in Congress. The issue of slavery had sort of lain dormant under the surface. Now it rose to the surface again. In this case, it wasn't a party vote. It wasn't Democrats versus Whigs. It was North versus South. And this was a very bad sign. And as a result, you can guess which House of Congress passed the resolution. The House of Representatives did, because they were dominated by Northerners, because they had an edge in population. The Senate did not. So the Wilmot Proviso goes down to defeat, but the bad blood and the divisions between North and South remain. Now these divisions show up in the election of 1848. The main question is, will new territories that were gained from Mexico be slave or free? Now, in the election that year, candidates did their best to avoid the issue. They did that in different ways. The Whig candidate was Zachary Taylor of Louisiana. He avoided the question, but he owned 200 slaves, so Southerners were largely comfortable for voting in voting for him. The Democratic candidate was Lewis Cass of Michigan, and he favored popular sovereignty. He said, let the territories decide, basically passing the buck. There were a number of Whigs called conscience Whigs, as opposed to cotton Whigs, who were very unhappy with the nomination of a slaveholder from Louisiana. There were also Democrats who were unhappy with the wishy-washy policy advocated by Cass, and they formed a third party, the Free Soil Party, and their nominee was the former president, Martin Van Buren of New York. And his position was very clear. No slavery should be allowed in the territories. Now, they were never going to win a national election with this position, but what they did do is split the Democratic Party in New York, since Martin Van Buren was from New York and had been a Democrat, and that gave New York to Taylor, and with it, the election. So the winner of the election of 1848 was Zachary Taylor, and we'll go into this in more detail when we look at the coming of the Civil War.